Hello, friends at Peace United Church of Christ in Webster Groves. I'm John Dorhauer, and I'm serving as the pastor at First Congregational United Church of Christ in DeKalb, Illinois. And on their behalf, I bring you greetings as you go through this season of contemplation and discernment, and as you prepare to be good stewards of the resources entrusted to you. I was asked in the midst of this time of discernment, in the midst of your stewardship campaign, as you talk about sending and mission, to bring a word to you. And that's what I'd like to do today. I have chosen for my passage the beautiful passage from Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. And preceding that, Moses is on the mountain, the burning bush that we're all familiar with. He encounters, he's told to take off his sandals for he's on sacred ground. And he's in the middle of this mystical experience and not entirely sure what's happening around him when we hear the voice of God speak. And it's that voice of God that I want to focus a little attention on as you find yourself in this time of discernment. And I want to see what we can discover about the wisdom of this moment where God encounters Moses. You understand in context that much more is at stake here than a conversation between God and Moses. This will be for us, this entire Exodus experience that follows from this conversation, the formative experience that would tie us forever to this God, this liberation God. And that relationship, which persists to this day, and originating in this conversation, that moment, reveals something to us extraordinary about this God. And it was so impactful that for generation after generation after generation, we not only repeat the story, but we talk about it in ways that signal to us that this is and will always be our God. This is really in some ways a revelatory conversation. So there Moses is on the mountaintop. The bush is burning. He's taken off his sandal. He's hearing this voice. And I'm sure he's wondering, what in the world is going on here? Who is this? And what's my role in this? And the voice speaks. And in the first sentences, there are 4 declarations made that lead to a 5th declaration that I want to pay attention to. And these are not just I statements. They are I statements. They're I statements from the one who says, I am who I am. That's the only name we're given after this encounter with the sacred. When they ask who sent you, you say, I am who I am sent you. And that I am who I am begins these sentences, these 4 sentences with I statements. I observe. I know, I hear, and I come down. Now, I want to talk about those 4 statements because they are incredibly profound, and I hope that we never get to the point in our faith development, we never get to the point in our relationship with this God that those words don't astound us, don't amaze us. Some of the things that we say about God lead us to believe that what we just heard from God would never be possible, that God is so far removed from us, God is so far above us, God is unreachable, God is unknowable. And once we postulate those things about God, we have to be utterly taken aback by the revelation that our suffering is observed by God, is known by God. Our cries are heard by God. And having heard our cries and known our suffering and seen what we live with and live through, that God would then choose to come down in order to free us and liberate us from that which oppresses us. It's quite astounding, really. And that's what Moses is about to discover. That this I am who I am character in the presence of this burning bush in the middle of this mystical experience, creating the ground upon which they walk as sacred, turning that into sacred land, that in the midst of that, Moses hears that voice say, I've heard your cries. I've seen your suffering. I know. And please understand that that Hebrew verb know doesn't mean I cognate that. In other words, I'm doing some mental gymnastics in my head, and I understand what you're going through. That verb means I embody this. In other words, whatever you're feeling in the midst of your suffering, I have taken on into my own body. I know it. And it has become intolerable to me. And for that reason, I now come down and I'm going to set you free. So those are the 4 I statements that I want to focus on. And I want to get to their relevance for you in the middle of your discernment in a second. But there's a 5th I statement that follows that makes it very clear what God's pathway to the liberation of these enslaved peoples is going to be. Having seen their misery, having known and embodied their suffering, having heard their cries, and now having come down, God is going to act, not by God's own hand, but through human agency. That's where Moses comes into play here. And the I statement that follows all of those, these I statements from the one who is, I am who I am, that I statement is this: I send you. I have come, but I send you. And you are going to Pharaoh, and you are going to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses, and any who would come on with him, his brother Aaron, his sister Miriam, and the others, it would be Moses, through human agency, confronting the Pharaoh that would enact the liberation of the enslaved Israelites and set them on their course to the pathway to what God called the land flowing with milk and honey. It is not just the nature of this God to see our misery, to know our sufferings, to hear our cries, and to come down. But in coming down, it is the nature of this God, this I am who I am, to also send us, to partner with us in covenant, to be our God, to embody our suffering, to set us free from that, but to use the agency with which we are equipped to be the feet and hands of this God in the act of liberating those who suffer. So in your time of discernment, it doesn't surprise me, it shouldn't surprise you that you are placing yourself in relationship with and at the feet of a God who already knows what we suffer, but who isn't going to enact some sort of divine miracle in order to make the liberation possible. God is, as God has always done, going to call us, to send us. The word mission derives, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, from the Latin word missio, which simply means to send. Mission is ascending. And the voice of God speaks to us as an agent of sending us to do the work, to do the mission for the body of Christ. I am pleased to know that you are in this season of discernment, and in this season you are talking about mission. You are talking about your sending. What I want to do is introduce to you today the concept that in the artful act of discernment, of collectively listening to each other for the call that will emerge, here are things that I want you to pay attention to. And this is really where this Exodus passage comes in. And I learned this from my mentor, the man I call my spiritual father. He used to say, listen for the cries. This is what God did. I hear your cries. Whose cries do you hear? And hear in such a way that the suffering you observe from the midst of those cries is a suffering that you can embody. And to put it more strongly, that you cannot not embody. It eats at you. Their suffering eats at you. And you will never be full or whole or free yourself until you can see a pathway to their being free from that suffering. You have to listen for those cries. They are out there. You can hear them. And when you come together to talk to one another and discern what mission you are sent to do, to undertake, what calling you have been given by the God who observes and sees and knows our suffering, what you must do as you come together is listen to each other's voices, speak about whose cries are reaching out to you, whose voice in crying out can you no longer not hear. Their suffering is embodied in you. Now, there will be times in which that's just individual work that you do, and you're going to respond to those cries. But this is collective work that you are doing. And somebody in your midst is crying out. And somebody's voice is being lifted up. And wondering, as the enslaved peoples of Israel wondered when we cry out, is anybody even hearing us? Is anybody listening to us? And the active ear of God in service to humankind is the one who heard, and whose hearing made all of the difference, but who upon hearing chose to enact human agents as tools of liberation. And that's the work that you're about. I know that one of the questions that you are addressing in this time of discernment isn't just about mission, isn't just about sending, but what does it mean to be the church? What does it mean to be a church in this season where so much change is going on? And we've talked about that before, and I know many of you have read my book. I'm going to reduce what I know about the future of the church in the context of your discernment about mission and about sending. I'm going to reduce all of that to two statements that I think most matter in terms of what's changing and in terms of what you need to be paying attention to in this time of discernment in order to remain relevant, in order to remain an authentic community of faith, and in order to be seen as trustworthy by those who are seeking an encounter and a relationship with the sacred. And those two things are, one, no matter how you gather, no matter when you gather, no matter where you gather. And those are all relevant questions, as you well know. The question of where you gather is one that you took to heart and made a conscientious decision about for the sake of your mission. So no matter when you gather, no matter how you gather, no matter where you gather, no matter with whom you gather, you're looking to do one thing when you gather, and that is to act in ways that open up the possibility for an encounter with the sacred. This, too, is part of the artful act of discernment for any community of faith. And you must be honest with each other and speak openly to one another about whether or not the when you're doing it, about the where you're doing it, about the how you're doing it, about the what you're doing, actually opens up a pathway to the sacred for you. The truth is, there are things that we can do in a coming together in a spirit of worship that inhibit our pathways to the sacred. Some of that is personal, and some of that is generational, and some of that is cultural. But all of that is in many ways communal and deserves to be talked about. So in this time of discernment and in wondering what will be relevant in becoming church in the future, ask yourself if your coming together enables you to have an authentic encounter with the sacred. Because when you're talking about the modern worshiper and the modern seeker, when you're talking about what some would call the postmodern, or what some are now referring to as the meta-modern worshiper, if what you are doing is not creating for them a pathway to the sacred, they're not going to see you as authentic and trustworthy and relevant. So that's the first, I think, and most important question in this season of discernment. Are you finding your way to the sacred when you come together? Are the things that you are doing enabling and enhancing the opening up of that space for the sacred to be present in very powerful and very real ways? The second thing, and this will directly relate to mission. The first one I'll connect in a second. The second thing is, what is your community doing? Not just in the community in terms of mission, but in particular for those who are actively a part of your community. What are you doing to engage their gifts and their passions and their resources and their talents in ways that matter and make a difference in the community. If you're not doing that, if you're not first giving people a pathway to the sacred, and second, acknowledging that they bring with them gifts that can be utilized for the common good of all, then you are not what will be recognized very quickly. You are not what should be recognized as an authentic, a trustworthy, and a relevant community of faith. I think of all of the things, again, that we can talk about, those two things are the most important. And in your season of discernment and in your pathway of becoming, keep those two things at the forefront. Are we gathering in ways that open up pathways to the sacred for those who are here? And are we acknowledging, recognizing, and utilizing the gifts of those present and enabling them to make a difference in their world? Do those two things and you will be an authentic and a relevant and a trustworthy community of faith. Now, I want to connect that first thing, that act of opening a pathway to the sacred, with the second thing about engaging the people who come before you and the resources that they bring in the world in ways that make a difference. And it directly relates to the conversation you're having with one another about discerning the voice of a God who sends us in mission. As you come together and open up pathways to the sacred, what are you hearing from the voice of the still speaking God? And it may be, because remember that Matthew 25 verse, whatever you do to the least of these, you're doing unto me. It may be that the voice of God is heard in the cries of those around you in the community who are suffering. That may well be the voice of the sacred speaking to you as it did directly to Moses. It may be God's way of saying, I am present. I see, I observe, I know, I embody the suffering around me. And in our coming together in this sacred space, you are going to hear my voice speak to you of the cries that you should not be ignoring. Be open to that possibility with one another and talk to each other about what you're hearing when you gather with the sacred. And then the second thing, when you talk about whose cries you hear, talk about what you can do to engage the resources that you have to make a difference. I think there are a couple of mistakes that churches can make, especially churches that orient along the progressive theological line that I know you orient on and that I do as well. And that is, there are so many voices crying out that if you fail to respond to any of them, you are not doing the work of a Christian disciple, and do not fall into that trap. When I was the conference minister in the Southwest, we were small. We had resources with which we could make a difference, but not everywhere. And I remember going through a year of discernment, at the end of which we gathered in our annual meeting, the leaders together, and said, we're going to pick one thing. We're going to pick one thing. And I know there are 10 things that all of you here are feeling passionate about and that you think we should be doing, and that you think if we're not doing, we're not being faithful. We're going to pick one thing. And we picked one thing. And knowing who we were and the resources that we brought to bear and the cries that we were hearing and where we were located and all of that, we decided we were going to be committed to the work of the immigrant in our midst. Now, I don't want to tell you everything about what happened there, but I do want to tell you about two congregations that are 42 kilometers apart on Highway 89. And I say 42 kilometers because it's the only stretch of highway in the U.S. that's measured in kilometers and not miles. One is in Nogales and one is in Green Valley. And the church in Green Valley said, having heard the cries in their midst, having chosen that they will do one thing, they said, we are a church at the border called to serve the immigrant. And that's what they did. The church in Nogales, they were shrinking. Unlike the church in Green Valley, who said we're a church on the border called to serve the immigrant, they started growing. The church in Nogales was shrinking. And they couldn't afford a pastor, and they couldn't afford the property. They had enough money to pay for one or the other. Both of them were about half their budget, and they had to discern whether or not we're going to be a church with a mission and a building, but not a pastor, or a church with a mission and a pastor and not a building. There was no option of being a church without a mission. And they too, being a church on the border, decided that they were called to serve the immigrant. and decided they were going to do that without a pastor. And literally, they became the pastor unto themselves and knew that the building itself would be critical in their mission to serve the immigrant. Now, I tell you those stories only because these are examples of, first of all, how a conference centered down on its mission and got real with what we can do, with who we are and where we are and what we bring to the table, and how two churches then responded to that clear missional call. I don't know what that is for you, but don't make the mistake of saying, we hear all of the cries, we're going to respond to all of them. Find a cry or maybe two that emerges in your midst, that you have the resources to make a difference, that maybe nobody else is going to pay attention to, and cries that you can no longer ignore. The hearing of the cry, the knowing of their suffering, and not just knowledge, but embodying of that suffering, the observing of that misery, and the call to be sent to liberate them from that suffering. That, my friends, is the journey that you are on together. You are an authentic, worshiping, gathering body. I know that every Sunday you come together, you feel the presence of our God, our risen Savior, the presence of the sacred, the Holy Spirit among you. Pay attention to that. Listen to the voice of that still speaking God. Listen for the cries of those among you. And choose a pathway. You will be sent. You will be called. You have gifts and talents and passions and resources to bring to bear, and you will make a difference. And I can't wait to have a conversation with Wendy and some of your leaders somewhere down the road to hear the stories about the difference you are making in your world and in your community. God bless you all.